As the sun sank behind the dusty horizon, the sleepy town of Deadwood Gulch was about to awaken to something darker than it could imagine. A stranger, young and dangerous, stepped off the trail with a reputation that echoed before him. His challenge to the sheriff was a reckless gamble, one he'd soon regret. The sheriff, a man of few words and an even fewer survivors, had a past that would haunt anyone who crossed him. The streets went still as the two faced off, the tension thick, the town holding its breath. What started as a duel would quickly spiral into a deadly game, and by the end, they'd all learn. In this town, legends don't die. They make others wish they hadn't lived. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from. If you like this story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because tomorrow we have a special story for you. The town of Deadwood Gulch was as rough and unpolished as the land that surrounded it. Dust swirled in the streets, kicked up by the occasional horse-drawn wagon or the boots of an old prospector heading into town for supplies. Life here was simple: survive or move on. For the men and women who called Deadwood Gulch home, that meant a long, hard day of work, the occasional brawl, and always being prepared for the unexpected. It was in such a town, one blistering hot summer afternoon, that the stranger arrived. The wind was beginning to pick up when he rode in. His horse, a sturdy bay, was lean but strong, having no doubt crossed many miles of desert and prairie. He wore a long coat, though it was already soaked through with sweat, his wide-brimmed hat casting shadows over his face. The dust kicked up behind him as he slowed the horse to a walk, its hooves echoing on the weathered wooden planks of the town's main street. The townsfolk were used to strangers passing through, but there was something different about this one. His posture was too confident, too assured for a man who was just passing through. He didn't seem to be looking for a drink or a place to stay. No, this man had purpose in his stride, a kind of energy that sent a ripple of tension through the air. A few folks stopped their work and turned to watch as he rode past the general store, the saloon, and finally to the steps of the sheriff's office. When he dismounted, the stranger didn't bother tying his horse. He simply walked up to the door of the sheriff's office and pushed it open with a casual force. Inside, Sheriff Nathan Hale looked up from his desk, his sharp blue eyes meeting the stranger's dark gaze. Nathan didn't speak right away. Instead, he studied the newcomer, his hand resting on the polished grip of the revolver at his side. "I'm here for a man," the stranger said, his voice low but carrying. "The one you call Hale?" Nathan's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles. "That's me," he said evenly, not showing any sign of surprise. "What can I do for you?" The stranger didn't hesitate. "I've come to challenge you to a duel." There was a moment of silence, and then Nathan's smile vanished. His fingers lightly touched the edge of his desk, tapping it once, twice. His gaze never wavered, but there was something about him that made the air feel suddenly heavier, thicker. "I don't usually participate in duels," Nathan said slowly, his voice calm but firm. "Oh, you'll participate? All right," the stranger pressed. "I've heard all the stories, the ones about the legend that haunts these parts. The man who can shoot faster than a rattlesnake strikes. The man who never misses. I've got a reputation to make, and I aim to do it right here, in front of every man and woman in Deadwood Gulch. So, unless you're scared, I suggest you step outside." The challenge hung in the air like the heat of the midday sun. Outside, a small crowd had begun to gather, curious to see what was happening, their voices murmuring with anticipation. Nathan stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor as he did. His gaze shifted to the window for a moment, his eyes scanning the street. The townsfolk were already gathering, murmuring amongst themselves. He knew this would be a spectacle, one that would likely end in blood. But what the stranger didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Nathan Hale wasn't just any sheriff. He wasn't even just a good shot. He was a man of few words, but every one of those words was a warning. A warning that, for a man like this newcomer, would come far too late. "I don't want any trouble," Nathan said calmly, his voice devoid of any emotion. "But if you're set on this, then I'll meet you in the street." The stranger smirked. "Good. I like a man who's ready to face the facts." Nathan reached into his coat, his hand brushing the smooth leather of his holster, feeling the cold steel of the revolver inside. His movements were slow, deliberate. He didn't need to rush. He wasn't concerned. Outside, the crowd had gathered, forming a loose circle in the street. The heat from the sun pressed down on them, the dust swirling in the air. But no one seemed to mind. All eyes were on Nathan Hale and the stranger as they stepped into the middle of the dusty road. The stranger's hand hovered near his holster, his fingers twitching, eager. Nathan remained calm, his eyes locked on the man across from him. It was a standoff, but it wasn't just a contest of speed. It was a contest of wills. The crowd held their breath, knowing that, in the next few moments, everything would change. And it was then that the stranger made the mistake of underestimating the man standing across from him. The wind carried a tense silence over the street as the two men faced off. The crowd, a mixture of curious townsfolk and hardened drifters, shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flicking between the sheriff and the stranger. Everyone knew the stakes of a duel in Deadwood Gulch. Two men stood in the street, and one would walk away, while the other would be left behind in the dust. But what they didn't know was that this wasn't a duel like any other. Not with Nathan Hale involved. The stranger's fingers twitched near the grip of his revolver, his chest heaving with anticipation. His eyes flicked over to the crowd, the weight of their gaze settling on him. He had made a name for himself in other towns, challenging men and taking what was theirs: respect, reputation, and sometimes life. He had heard the whispers about Nathan Hale, the sheriff with the unblemished record. A sharpshooter, a ghost among men, known for his uncanny precision. But the stranger wasn't afraid. Not yet. He had practiced his draw in countless towns, had already bested men with quicker hands and sharper eyes. This would be no different. The sheriff might be a legend, but legends fell just like men did. A bullet was just a bullet, no matter how fast it came. Nathan stood still, his body relaxed but alert. His boots dug into the dusty street as his right hand hung loosely at his side, fingers resting just above the revolver's grip. His blue eyes were cold, like the sharpest winter frost, yet there was a subtle confidence about him. He had heard the stranger's words, but they had not stirred him. This was a moment he had seen 1,000 times, a moment where the world seemed to slow, where every detail stood out with brutal clarity. The sound of the wind, the flicker of light on metal, the weight of the dust as it swirled in the air. Nathan wasn't just a sheriff. He was a man of instinct, of reflexes that had been honed in countless battles across the West. The stranger shifted slightly, a movement that was almost imperceptible but enough to trigger a reaction. The crowd murmured in anticipation. Nathan's eyes followed the motion, watching as the stranger's hand inched closer to the revolver. And then, like a sudden storm breaking, the world exploded into motion. The stranger's hand snapped toward his holster, drawing his weapon in a flash. But it was too late. Nathan's hand moved with deadly speed, the barrel of his revolver coming up and firing in a single fluid motion. The sound of the shot echoed through the town, louder than any clap of thunder, and the stranger's own revolver was still half drawn when the bullet struck his chest. The crowd gasped collectively, their faces frozen in shock as the stranger staggered back. The look of disbelief in his eyes was almost comical. His hand dropped from the revolver, and he looked down at the blood blooming across his shirt. He hadn't even had time to pull the trigger. The sheriff had already taken the advantage. The stranger's legs buckled, and he collapsed to his knees, a slow, agonizing fall to the dust. His breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, his body trembling from the shock of the wound. He tried to reach for his gun, but his arm fell limp at his side, his fingers barely able to twitch. Nathan stepped forward, his boots making no sound on the wooden street. His revolver was still in hand, the smoke from the shot curling in the dry air around him. He didn't need to say anything. The message was clear. He had won, and the stranger had lost. The crowd remained silent, almost afraid to breathe. Nathan paused, staring down at the man who had dared challenge him. There was no satisfaction in his gaze, no triumph, just a quiet, calm assurance that this was how it had to be. He had been here before, in countless towns, in countless duels. This was just another day. The stranger's eyes, wide with pain, flickered toward the sheriff. His lips parted, as if to speak, but only a strangled gasp escaped. Blood dripped from the wound in his chest, staining the dust beneath him a darker red. He managed to lift his head, his eyes locking with Nathan's, a mixture of disbelief and regret in them. You. The words were broken, lost in the gasp of air he could barely catch. Nathan lowered his gun slowly, the barrel cooling in the heat of the day. He wasn't one to gloat, not even in moments like this. His voice, when it came, was as quiet as the calm before the storm. You should have known, Nathan said simply. Not everyone is meant for this life. The stranger's hand trembled as it tried to reach for his revolver one last time. But it was no use. He slumped forward, his head resting against the dirt. The life drained from him slowly, like water slipping through a cracked barrel. The crowd around them began to stir, whispers starting to fill the air. The tension of the duel was over, but the weight of what had just happened hung thick over them all. Nathan Hale had done what he always did. He had ended the fight before it had even truly begun. A few of the townsfolk began to edge closer, a mixture of curiosity and fear in their eyes. They had seen duels before, but nothing like this. Nothing so swift, so decisive. The sheriff stood motionless, watching the stranger's body slowly settle into the dust, the life fading from his eyes. For a moment, Nathan simply observed, the silence stretching longer than it should have. And then, as the sun dipped lower into the sky, he turned and walked back to the sheriff's office without a word. As he passed through the door, he cast one last look over his shoulder at the gathered crowd, who were still frozen, staring at the fallen man. His gaze held no malice, no anger, just the calm, unyielding certainty of a man who had lived through far worse and was still standing tall. Nathan didn't need to speak. His reputation had already done the talking for him. Inside the sheriff's office, he set the revolver down on the desk, his fingers brushing the cold metal once more. He had one, but it was never about the victory. It was about survival. And in the West, survival was everything. The duel was over, but the legend of Nathan Hale, the sharpshooter who never missed, would live on. Nightfall descended upon Deadwood Gulch with a heavy, suffocating calm. The sun's fiery presence had finally given way to the moon, casting a pale, eerie light over the town. The streets, once bustling with the murmur of voices and the shuffle of boots, were now quiet, save for the occasional creak of a sign swaying in the wind. The saloon was still, its patrons too nervous to celebrate, too aware of the weight of the day's events. Word of the duel had already spread like wildfire through the town, and people were talking in hushed voices, wondering who the sheriff really was, and if they had made a mistake in ever doubting him. Inside the sheriff's office, Nathan sat behind his desk, his long legs stretched out before him. The air was thick with the scent of dust and leather, the faintest trace of gunpowder still lingering. His revolver was resting beside him, polished and gleaming under the dim lantern light. He stared at it for a moment, a soft furrow forming between his brows. It wasn't the first time he had ended a life, but it was the first time in years that someone had come to him with such reckless confidence. The stranger, whoever he had been, had clearly underestimated what it meant to face Nathan Hale. It wasn't just about speed. It wasn't even about accuracy. It was about instinct, years of experience, and the stillness of a man who had already lived through far too many moments like that one. His hand shifted, fingers lightly brushing the revolver once more. The weight of it felt familiar, like an extension of himself. He had never needed to draw quickly. He never rushed. A man who rushed, a man who acted out of anger or haste, was a man who was already beaten. Nathan had learned that early on, in the heat of battles where life had no second chances. There was a knock at the door, soft but firm. Nathan didn't look up. He knew who it was before the sound even registered. The door opened, and the figure of Deputy Ben Morrow stepped inside, his face pale, his eyes wide with the same mixture of fear and admiration that had been reflected in the faces of the townsfolk earlier. "You all right, Sheriff?" Ben asked, his voice a little too high, a little too nervous. Nathan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I'm fine. You?" Ben hesitated, his eyes flicking to the desk where the stranger's blood still stained the wood. He could smell the lingering scent of death in the room. "I reckon I'm just trying to figure out what the hell happened today. I've never seen anything like that. Never even heard of anyone getting a shot off before they—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "He never even had a chance. Some men don't," Nathan said quietly. "And some men don't know what they're getting into when they challenge the wrong person." Ben shifted his weight uneasily, clearly wanting to ask more questions, but unsure how far he could push. The deputy had been with Nathan for years now, but he still didn't know the full scope of the sheriff's past. There were things Nathan didn't talk about, things that went unsaid, because some stories were better left untold. It was easier that way. It was safer. "I heard he was a gunman," Ben ventured cautiously, taking a step toward the desk. "A real fast one, too. Is that true?" Nathan's gaze flicked up, his sharp blue eyes locking onto Ben's. There was no hint of emotion in his face, just the same cold, calculating stillness that everyone in the town had come to recognize. "He wasn't as fast as he thought he was," Nathan replied softly. "And that's what cost him." Ben swallowed hard, still trying to process the event, trying to understand how someone, especially someone as brash as the stranger, could fall so quickly. "But how did you know? How did you know he'd—" Nathan interrupted, his voice a low rasp, barely a whisper. "I've seen men like him before. Men who think they can outdraw a legend. They all make the same mistake. They underestimate the time it takes for a bullet to reach them, and they think their speed is something more than it is." There was a pause, as Ben tried to digest the information, but the sheriff didn't continue. It wasn't necessary. Nathan wasn't one to explain his actions. He didn't need to. In this life, you either understood or you didn't. You either survived, or you ended up like the stranger, dead in the dirt with nothing to show for it. "I reckon word's going to spread," Ben said, his voice heavy with concern. "Some folks are going to start wondering just who you are, Sheriff. The legend, like they say. They'll want to know if it's true." Nathan's eyes narrowed, and he stood up slowly, his boots scraping against the floor. He walked over to the window and stared out at the darkened town. The moonlight cast long shadows across the street, the quiet hum of life in Deadwood Gulch continuing despite the violence of the day. But the silence wouldn't last long. Word traveled fast in the West, and the story of the duel would become something bigger, something more than just a shootout. It would become part of the sheriff's legacy. "The legend doesn't need to be true, Ben," Nathan said, his voice distant. "It only needs to be real." Ben didn't understand the weight of Nathan's words at first. He wasn't a man who had seen what the sheriff had seen, who had lived through the horrors of the West, who had walked away from battles that should have killed him. The legend wasn't something to be celebrated. It was something to be survived. Because legends weren't born, they were made. And those who made them were usually the ones who paid the price. Ben watched Nathan for a moment longer, then nodded, sensing that it was time to leave the subject alone. The sheriff didn't talk about his past, and Ben had learned long ago to respect that silence. "I'll make sure the body's taken care of," Ben said softly, stepping toward the door. "But I don't think anyone will be looking to start any trouble after today." Nathan didn't respond, his gaze still fixed on the street outside. The town was quiet, too quiet, and Nathan knew that there were always those who would challenge the unknown. But they had no idea what they were walking into. As the door closed behind Ben, Nathan turned back to the desk. His hand hovered over the revolver again, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. The weight of the gun was familiar, a comforting presence in a world that was anything but predictable. He wasn't the kind of man to seek out attention. He wasn't the kind of man to make a spectacle of himself. But in the West, men like him didn't get to choose. They were legends whether they liked it or not. And as Nathan Hale sat alone in the dimly lit office, he knew that the next time someone came looking for trouble, they wouldn't be so quick to challenge the sheriff of Deadwood Gulch. The days that followed the duel were a strange mix of silence and whispers, as if the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The heat of the summer sun continued to blister over Deadwood Gulch, but a chill had settled into the people. It was the kind of chill that came with respect, the kind that wrapped itself around you like a shadow, making sure you remembered just who you were dealing with. Sheriff Nathan Hale didn't make a habit of visiting the saloon, but this morning, as the sun crept lazily over the horizon, he found himself there, his boots tapping a slow rhythm on the wooden floor. The building was quiet, save for the low murmur of conversation at the far end. A few of the regulars were already nursing whiskey, the amber liquid casting a slight glow in the dim light. A poker game was taking place in the corner, the shuffle of cards punctuating the soft chatter. Nathan's gaze swept over the room. Most of the folks who had been there during the duel avoided looking at him directly, as though not wanting to provoke his attention. But there was one man sitting at the bar, a stranger to the sheriff, someone Nathan hadn't seen before. The man was lean, his face weathered by time and hardship, with sharp eyes that flicked toward the sheriff the moment he stepped inside. The stranger didn't look like someone looking for trouble. He looked more like a man who had been through it all and was just waiting for the next hand to be dealt. Still, Nathan couldn't help but feel a prickle of caution. There was something about the way the man watched him that made his instincts flare, even though he didn't quite understand why. The barkeep, a grizzled man named Sam, gave Nathan a small nod as he made his way toward the bar. Nathan didn't waste time with pleasantries. He'd never been one for unnecessary conversation. "What'll it be?" Sam asked, his voice rough from years of hard work. "A whiskey," Nathan replied, his eyes still lingering on the stranger. "And make it quick." The barkeep didn't ask any more questions. He poured the drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass as he slid it toward Nathan. The sheriff took it without a word, lifting the glass to his lips and savoring the burn as it slid down his throat. The stranger at the bar hadn't moved, but Nathan could feel the tension in the room rising. There was something about this man that wasn't quite right, something that suggested he wasn't just passing through like so many others who came to Deadwood Gulch. His eyes never left the sheriff's face, though there was no hostility in them, only an unspoken understanding. An understanding that spoke of old rivalries, past encounters, and shared histories. "You're Hale, ain't you?" The man's voice was low, but there was a sharpness to it, like a blade waiting for the right moment to strike. Nathan's gaze never wavered as he set his glass down, his hand resting on the counter, fingers brushing against the smooth wood. He didn't answer the question right away. He didn't need to. The man knew exactly who he was. "I've heard the stories," the stranger continued, his voice a little louder now, enough for those at the poker table to glance up, "about how you're the fastest, the deadliest, the one who never misses." He paused, leaning forward slightly, a grin playing at the corners of his lips. "But what I want to know is, how do you feel about a real challenge?" Nathan didn't flinch. He had been through this before. The stranger's bravado was familiar, the kind of thing that was all too common in these parts, a man trying to prove himself by picking a fight with the wrong person. But there was something in the way the man carried himself, a confidence that seemed grounded in experience. He wasn't like the last fool, the one who had dropped dead before he even got the chance to fire. "Let me guess," Nathan said, his voice calm, his eyes steady on the stranger. "You're looking to make a name for yourself, too?" The stranger's grin widened, but there was no malice in it. "You could say that. I've been around these parts a time or two, but I've never been one to back down from a challenge. And after what I heard about you, well, I thought it'd be a good time to see if the stories were true." Nathan's eyes flickered to the window, his gaze drifting over the empty street outside. It was early, too early for anyone to be out in force, but he knew what this meant. The stranger wasn't just a man looking for fame. He was looking for a fight. And in this town, when you sought out trouble, trouble was always ready to meet you. "I don't do duels for sport," Nathan said softly, his voice a low rasp. "And I don't do them for men who think they can prove something by challenging the wrong person." The stranger chuckled, as though the sheriff's words didn't faze him. "So, that's it? You're just gonna sit there, all quiet-like, while I stand here and call you out?" Nathan's fingers curled slightly around the edge of his glass, his grip tightening ever so slightly. He wasn't a man who spoke often, but when he did, it was always deliberate. The silence between them thickened, the tension building, and Nathan knew the man wasn't going to back down. He would keep pushing, testing Nathan until the sheriff either responded or sent him away. But Nathan didn't feel the need to entertain the stranger's game. He didn't need to prove anything. The reputation that had followed him from town to town was enough. The duel with the last man had made that clear. And though this new challenger seemed to have a certain confidence, a certain understanding of what it took to survive in the West, Nathan wasn't worried. The problem with men like him was that they didn't know when to stop pushing. They didn't know when to walk away. "I'm not the man you want to challenge," Nathan finally said, his voice low but firm. "You're playing a dangerous game, and you don't know the rules." The stranger leaned back on his stool, his eyes narrowing as he took in Nathan's words. There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. But then, just as quickly as it had come, it vanished, replaced by the same cocky grin that had been there before. "Maybe you're right, Hale," he said, tipping his hat back slightly. "Maybe I don't know the rules, but I figure I've got enough guts to find out." He slid off his stool and turned to face Nathan directly, his posture shifting, preparing for whatever came next. Nathan's eyes never left the man's face. He wasn't fazed. He wasn't concerned. But what did concern him was the fact that this man, this stranger, had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The air in the saloon had thickened. The stranger's words lingered in the dim light, hanging between them like smoke. Nathan's gaze never faltered, and neither did the stranger's. The sheriff wasn't sure whether this man truly understood the magnitude of the situation, but he was about to learn, one way or another. The sounds of the saloon seemed to fade as the two locked eyes. The low hum of the poker game, the clink of glasses, the shuffle of cards, they all disappeared into a blur. It was just the sheriff and the stranger now, the unspoken challenge hanging in the air like a live wire, waiting to snap. "I reckon you're a stubborn one," Nathan said finally, his voice almost a whisper, but it carried with the weight of years of experience. "I can respect that, but you need to understand something. This isn't about guts or reputation. This is about surviving long enough to make it through the next day." The stranger took a step closer, his boots making a soft thud against the wooden floor. His fingers twitched, as if his hand itched to reach for the revolver at his side. But Nathan wasn't worried. "Not yet. I've survived plenty," the stranger said, his tone thick with defiance. "But I reckon I'll survive this too. You think you're the only one who's quick on the draw, who knows how to take a man down? I've got my own tricks, old man." Nathan's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile, but it wasn't one of amusement. It was the kind of smile that came from a deep understanding, a wisdom earned through bloodshed. "It's not about tricks," he said, his voice still calm, his hands steady at his sides. "It's about understanding when to move and when not to. Some men spend their whole lives thinking they can outdraw anyone. But the real trick is knowing that a bullet doesn't give you second chances. You miss and you're dead." The stranger's eyes darkened, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. "Enough talk," he snapped, his hand flying to his holster in a swift motion. His fingers closed around the grip of the revolver, pulling it out with lightning speed. The crowd in the saloon held their collective breath. A moment of silence passed as everyone watched, waiting for the inevitable clash. But Nathan's hand was already moving, his fingers brushing the cold metal of his own revolver before the stranger even had time to fully aim. It was the kind of speed that only came from years of instinct, from countless encounters with death and the understanding of what it meant to survive. The sound of the gunshot was a sharp crack that reverberated through the saloon, louder than any noise the room had heard before. The stranger's revolver never even made it halfway to his target before the bullet from Nathan's gun struck the wood of the bar just inches from his hand, sending a splintering crack through the air. For a moment, the stranger stood frozen, his revolver still raised in the air, his hand trembling slightly. The crowd stared in stunned silence. The shot had been so precise, so deliberate, that they couldn't even process it. The stranger wasn't dead, but he might as well have been. Nathan's gun was already lowered, his fingers relaxing from the trigger, his expression as calm as ever. "You've got a lot to learn," Nathan said quietly. "You can't just draw and fire. You have to think. You have to wait. That's what makes a man a legend. Not how fast he can pull a trigger, but how well he can control the situation." The stranger, now visibly shaken, slowly lowered his gun, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and awe. He had come to the saloon looking to make a name for himself, but now he stood face to face with the reality of what he was up against. His hand shook as he let the revolver fall to his side. His pride, the very thing that had driven him here, slipping away. I didn't think. The words tumbled out of his mouth, his bravado shattered. He had no idea what had just happened. He had drawn first, as he had done countless times before. But Nathan hadn't just outdrawn him. He had made him look like a fool. Nathan took a slow step forward, his boots silent on the floor. The man's wide eyes never left him, a mixture of fear and realization creeping across his face. "It's not about being fast," Nathan said, his voice low and steady. "It's about knowing when you've already lost." He paused, taking a breath. "And you've lost, my friend." The stranger swallowed, his throat dry, and for the first time, he seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. He wasn't in control. He wasn't the one who could dictate the outcome. This wasn't a fair contest. This was survival. I didn't mean no harm," the stranger muttered, his voice shaky. He backed away slowly, taking one step back from the sheriff, his face a picture of confusion and fear. Nathan's eyes never left him. He didn't move a muscle. "You came here looking for a fight," he said softly, "and you found it. But you weren't ready for what it would cost." The stranger turned, his eyes darting to the door, but his steps were unsteady. He hadn't planned on this, hadn't expected to be so easily bested. The duel he had hoped for had turned into something far more humbling. He had come in with a bravado that had made him feel invincible, but now that arrogance was crumbling away, leaving only a man who had realized that he had stepped into the lion's den and was lucky to leave alive. As he stumbled toward the door, Nathan's voice followed him. "You're lucky I didn't take you down like I did the last one. But don't come back here again. Not unless you're ready to deal with the consequences." The stranger didn't look back. He didn't need to. The sheriff's words had done enough to warn him. Without another word, he pushed through the door, disappearing into the stillness of the night. Inside the saloon, the crowd began to stir, but no one spoke. The tension was still thick in the air, the weight of what had just happened settling over them like a heavy fog. They had witnessed something rare, something that many in Deadwood Gulch would talk about for years to come. Nathan Hale had not only proven himself once again, but he had done so without even breaking a sweat. The sheriff's reputation had been solidified once more, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of the stranger's retreating footsteps echoed in the night. The days following the encounter in the saloon were quieter, almost unnaturally so. The stranger had left town, and with him went the noise and bravado that had filled the air like a storm. In the absence of his challenge, Deadwood Gulch returned to its usual rhythm. Hard work, long hours, and the occasional rumble of gossip circulating like wildfire through the town's cracks and crevices. Sheriff Nathan Hale didn't expect much to change. He had made his point. The townsfolk knew not to mess with him, and for the most part, they kept their distance. They hadn't truly understood his quiet strength until the stranger's foolhardy challenge. And now, as always, the sheriff moved like a ghost through his town, a presence so constant and unshakable that it felt almost unreal. The heat of the sun had dulled to the golden hues of a late afternoon, casting long shadows across the dusty streets. Nathan was sitting at his desk, going through the mundane work of town life. Paperwork, requests for permits, and letters that never seemed to stop coming. His fingers moved slowly over the paper, making neat, practiced strokes as he signed his name without thought. It was the kind of task that occupied his hands, but his mind was elsewhere, somewhere far away, where the horizon stretched into nothingness. A knock at the door broke his concentration. It was soft at first, hesitant, but then louder, more urgent. Nathan's hand rested over the pen, and he didn't immediately rise. His instincts were sharp, though, and he knew whoever was on the other side wasn't here for the usual business. "Come in," Nathan called, his voice steady but expectant. The door creaked open, and a woman stepped inside, her boots making a soft sound on the wood floor. Nathan didn't need to look up to know who it was. There was only one woman who ever came to the sheriff's office with such purpose: Margaret Maggie Cole, the local schoolteacher, and one of the few people in town who dared to speak to Nathan with any regularity. The rest of the townsfolk kept their distance, either out of respect or fear, but Maggie had always been different. She respected Nathan, but she wasn't afraid to push him when she needed to. Her hair, dark and braided, framed her face, and her brown eyes were filled with a quiet intensity that Nathan had come to admire over the years. She wasn't a woman who made empty small talk, and Nathan liked that. She came straight to the point. "Nathan," she said softly, closing the door behind her and stepping closer to the desk. "There's a man in town, looking for you." Nathan didn't react immediately, but his brow furrowed slightly. "Another one?" he asked, his voice laced with a quiet weariness. He'd seen his fair share of challengers, and most of them, like the stranger, didn't last long. What was it about this town that attracted people with delusions of grandeur? Maggie hesitated, her gaze flickering to the window, as though weighing her words. "No," she replied carefully. "Not exactly. This one. He's different. His name's Elias Drake, and I've heard rumors about him." Nathan's eyes sharpened. The name struck something deep inside him. Elias Drake. He had heard the name before, many years ago. A gunslinger, known in several states. A man who had made his mark through blood and fire. A name that no one dared utter lightly. Elias Drake, Nathan repeated under his breath, the name tasting bitter on his tongue. The memory of it stirred something in him, something that had been buried long ago. It wasn't just the name. It was the reputation. Drake was known to kill for sport, to challenge the fastest men across the West just to prove he was the best. Nathan had crossed paths with him once, long before he'd taken up the role of sheriff. Back then, he was just a young man looking for his place in the world. But it was Drake who had shown him the true cost of that ambition. "I thought he was dead," Nathan said, almost to himself. The thought of the man sent a cold shiver down his spine. Maggie's face tightened. "I don't know if he's alive, Nathan, but he's here, and he's looking for you. Word has it, he's come to settle something. Something between the two of you." Nathan stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His fingers brushed the edge of the desk, but there was no hesitation in his movements. He knew this wasn't just a regular challenge. This was something else. This was a reckoning. "Where is he?" Nathan asked, his voice steady but colder now. "He's at the saloon. He's been asking about you all afternoon. Seems like he's been waiting for you to show up." Nathan's mind raced. He had no idea what Drake wanted, but he knew one thing for sure. If the man had come to Deadwood Gulch, it was because he was looking for something. Something that wasn't just about proving himself. There was unfinished business between them, something that had been simmering for years. "Thanks, Maggie," Nathan said, his voice low. He moved toward the door without another word. He didn't need to explain himself to her. He didn't need to tell her what had happened between him and Drake years ago. Some things were better left in the past, buried where no one could disturb them. But Maggie wasn't the kind of person who left things unsaid. She caught his arm before he could open the door, her grip firm but gentle. "Nathan," she said, her voice low, "be careful. I don't know what this is about, but I don't like the look of it." Nathan turned to face her, his expression hardening. He knew the danger. He always did. But there was something about Drake, something that Nathan couldn't quite shake off, no matter how many years had passed. The past had a way of coming back when you least expected it, and Nathan had no choice but to face it head-on. "I'll be fine," Nathan said, his tone final. He didn't have time for fear, not now. He opened the door and stepped out into the street, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The evening air was thick with the smell of dust and sweat, and the sound of the saloon's piano drifted through the air. He could already feel the eyes of the town on him, as if they were waiting for something to happen. The saloon loomed ahead, its doors swinging open with a creak as Nathan approached. He didn't know what Drake had in mind, but he knew that whatever it was going to end tonight. The reckoning he had feared for so long was finally here. And this time, it wouldn't just be a test of speed. It would be a test of something deeper, a test of survival. The sound of the piano grew louder as Nathan pushed the door open and stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. And there, sitting at the far end of the bar, was Elias Drake. Older, rougher, but unmistakable. The man who had haunted his past. Their eyes locked across the room, and the story between them was about to unfold once again. The saloon felt colder the moment Nathan stepped inside. The familiar creak of the swinging doors echoed like a warning, and every head in the room turned, their gazes shifting quickly from Nathan to the man at the bar. Elias Drake. His presence was like a shadow in the dim light, and the whole room seemed to hold its breath as if it understood the weight of this encounter. Elias Drake was a man who commanded attention. He sat at the far end of the bar, his elbows resting on the counter, a half-empty glass of whiskey in front of him. His face was weathered by years of hard living, and his eyes, though older now, still held that cold, calculating glint. His hair was graying at the temples, but his hands were as steady as ever, his fingers wrapped around the glass without shaking. He was a man who had lived through countless storms, and the calm demeanor he wore only made him more dangerous. Nathan's boots made a slow, deliberate sound as he crossed the room. The saloon was tense, the crowd aware of what was happening but unsure of how to react. The few regulars who were brave enough to stay quiet had already backed away, retreating into the shadows or the corners of the room. The poker game had stopped. The piano, once playing a light-hearted tune, had gone silent. All eyes were on Nathan as he approached the bar. Elias didn't acknowledge him at first. He didn't need to. He already knew Nathan was here. The sheriff's reputation had preceded him, just like it always did. But after a few long moments of silence, Drake's eyes finally lifted from his glass. His lips twitched into a small, almost imperceptible smile, as if he had been expecting this all along. Well, if it isn't the legendary Nathan Hale, Elias said, his voice deep and gravelly, the kind of voice that suggested too many years spent speaking through the smoke of guns and whiskey. He didn't move, didn't stand to face Nathan. He remained seated, his posture casual, almost mocking. I wasn't sure if you'd show up, or if you were just going to hide behind your reputation like all the others. Nathan's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step closer, his hand brushing against the worn wood of the bar as he reached for a drink. The glass was cool in his hand, the whiskey still strong and sharp. He wasn't here to talk. He wasn't here to exchange pleasantries. He was here to settle something that had been left unfinished for far too long. Drake, Nathan finally spoke, his voice low and measured. I thought you were dead, but I see you've made a habit of coming back from the grave. Elias chuckled softly, a sound that was half amusement and half something darker. You always did have a way with words, Nathan, but I'm still very much alive. And I didn't come here to talk about the past. I came for something else. His eyes flicked to Nathan's face, as if weighing him, studying him like a predator eyeing its prey. Nathan could feel it, the tension in the air, the pressure building with every second. This wasn't just another fight. This wasn't a challenge like the ones that had come before. This was personal. What do you want, Drake? Nathan asked, his voice hardening with a cold edge. Elias finally stood, the slow movement making it clear that he wasn't in any rush. He was in control here. He had always been in control. He turned slightly, his back now fully to the bar, and took a step toward Nathan. His presence filled the space between them, and even the onlookers in the room could feel the gravity of the moment. I didn't come here to waste time, Elias said, his voice dropping lower. I came here because I've got a score to settle. A score with you, Nathan. You might not remember, but I do. I remember the day you ruined me. You made me look like a fool in front of my men, and I've never forgotten that. You think you're untouchable, that you can just walk around like you own this place? Well, I've come to show you that nobody gets to walk away from me that easily. Nathan stood motionless, his hands still resting on the edge of the bar, his gaze locked onto Elias. The past rushed forward like a flood. The memories, the bitter taste of betrayal and violence, all came rushing back in a flood of clarity. It had been years since he and Elias had crossed paths, but Nathan had never forgotten that day. He had been younger then, brash and eager, just another gunman trying to carve out a place in the world. Drake had been a name to be feared, a man who ruled with his reputation, a man who would kill without hesitation. But Nathan had gotten in the way. He had crossed him, and in that moment, everything had changed. Nathan's heart rate didn't increase. His hand didn't move toward the revolver at his side. He knew this game. He knew exactly how this would unfold. He had done it before. You're right, Nathan said, his voice cold, detached. "I remember you, too. You and your men. But what you don't understand, Elias, is that you never stood a chance. You were too busy looking for power, for control. You didn't see the bigger picture. You didn't see that I wasn't like the others." Elias' eyes darkened, and his lip curled into a snarl. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this, not by anyone, let alone Nathan Hale. "You think you're better than me?" he growled. "You think you've earned some kind of respect?" Nathan took a step forward, his boots silent on the floor as the tension between them grew. "No," Nathan said, his voice now low and dangerous, the calm before the storm. "I don't think I'm better than you, but I'm damn sure faster." The words hung in the air for a moment, thick with the promise of what was to come. Elias stared at him, a moment of doubt flickering in his eyes. It was almost too fast for anyone to see, but Nathan felt it, a slight hesitation in the gunslinger's stance, a crack in his armor. And then it was over. Nathan's hand moved faster than any eye could track, the revolver drawn in a single, fluid motion. The shot rang out, a sharp, deafening sound that reverberated through the room like the thunder of an approaching storm. Elias didn't even have time to draw his gun. He barely had time to flinch before the bullet struck the glass in front of him, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. His eyes widened in shock, but his hand never moved toward his holster. Nathan had already beaten him to the punch. The room stood in stunned silence, the only sound the faint echo of the shot fading into the distance. Elias Drake stood frozen, a look of disbelief on his face. He had come looking for a reckoning, looking for a showdown with a man who had haunted his memories. But what he found was something far worse than he had ever imagined. Nathan lowered his revolver slowly, his fingers relaxing around the grip. His eyes never left Elias, who was now trembling, the fear of the moment creeping into his expression. "You'll leave Deadwood Gulch now," Nathan said, his voice as cold as the gunmetal that still rested in his hand. "And if you know what's good for you, you'll never come back." Elias opened his mouth, but no words came out. His hand slowly fell away from his holster, his gun still sheathed at his side. He looked like a man who had just realized he was no longer the hunter, but the hunted. He took a step back, then another, and without a word, he turned and walked out of the saloon, his shoulders hunched, his pride shattered. The room remained silent as Nathan holstered his gun. No one moved, no one dared to speak. The sheriff had done what he always did. He had proven that there was no one faster, no one who could challenge him and live. Outside, Elias Drake disappeared into the night, his reputation in tatters, and his life hanging by a thread. Inside the saloon, Nathan Hale stood alone, a silent legend in the eyes of those who witnessed it all. The dust settled in the saloon like it always did, but there was something different now. The tension had snapped like a taut rope, leaving behind a quiet so thick it seemed to suffocate the room. The patrons, who had once been frozen in fear and awe, slowly began to breathe again. Some exchanged cautious glances, as if unsure of what they had just witnessed, while others, particularly the regulars, nodded to themselves in silent respect. The man who had challenged Nathan Hale, who had tried to reclaim his own legend, was gone. Nathan didn't look around. He didn't need to. He didn't need the praise or the fear that the others were surely feeling. He simply turned his back to the bar, walked through the door, and stepped out into the street. The setting sun was casting long shadows across Deadwood Gulch, but the town felt smaller, quieter, after the showdown. Even the wind seemed to hush in reverence. The saloon door creaked behind him, and the low murmur of voices began to fill the air again. It wasn't a celebration, nor was it filled with the kind of chatter you'd expect after a victory. It was more like a collective exhale. People were trying to process what had just happened, trying to come to terms with what they had witnessed. Nathan Hale had once again proven that the stories about him weren't just myths. They weren't just tales to scare children or strangers. They were real, tangible, and rooted in something deep and unsettling. Nathan's boots kicked up the dry dust of the street as he walked, his eyes scanning the horizon. It had been a long time since he had felt the weight of the past creeping back up on him. Elias Drake had been more than just a name from his youth. He had been a ghost, an unhealed wound that Nathan had tried to bury along with the others he had left behind. But tonight, that ghost had returned, and in doing so, it had awakened something in Nathan that he couldn't ignore. There were too many memories, too many things buried beneath layers of time and silence, but he couldn't let them rise to the surface. Not now, not after everything that had happened. He had long learned that the past could swallow you whole if you weren't careful. He didn't stop as he reached the sheriff's office. He didn't need to. He could hear the faint creak of the door opening behind him, followed by the soft step of boots. It was Ben, his deputy. The young man had been with him for a few years now, and though he didn't have the grit of a seasoned outlaw or the sharp instincts of a veteran like Nathan, Ben had a heart that could be trusted, and that was something rare in these parts. "You did it again," Ben said, his voice a mix of admiration and caution. He was trying to make sense of it all, but Nathan could see the respect in his eyes. Nathan didn't turn around, but he could feel the weight of the words. The truth was, he hadn't done it again. Not in the way Ben might think. This wasn't about proving himself or showing the world that Nathan Hale was the fastest draw in the West. This wasn't about legacy. This was about survival. And Nathan had never been in the business of leaving loose ends. "What happened back there, Sheriff? He wasn't just some gunman. He was someone you knew." Ben's voice had softened, as if he had guessed what Nathan hadn't said out loud. Something more than just a simple challenge. Nathan sighed, his fingers brushing the brim of his hat as he adjusted it. The night air was still hot, but there was a slight breeze now, cooling the sweat on his brow. He didn't want to talk about it, but Ben's persistence was something he had learned to accept. "He was a man I crossed paths with a long time ago," Nathan said, his voice low, almost distant. "He wasn't the kind of man who could let things go, and I should have known that." Ben looked at the sheriff, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean? What kind of man was he?" Nathan turned slightly, his gaze meeting Ben's. There was no anger in his eyes, no bitterness, just the hard truth of someone who had lived a life most couldn't even imagine. Elias Drake was a gunslinger, but not the kind you'd see in the stories. He was a man who cared about power, not respect. And when you cross a man like that, when you challenge his need for control, he doesn't forget. Not ever. Nathan paused, his words hanging in the air like the heavy weight of a passing storm. "Drake and I, we had our differences. But it wasn't until years later that I realized how deep those differences ran. He wanted to be the best, and that meant eliminating anyone who stood in his way." Ben's face darkened as he processed Nathan's words. He had always known that his sheriff was more than just a man with quick hands and a calm demeanor. There was a story there, one that had shaped the man standing before him. "I never thought it would come to this," Nathan continued, his voice softer now. "But when you spend enough time in this business, you start to realize that some things come full circle. Some things can't be outrun." Ben stood quietly beside him, but he didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. The sheriff's words spoke volumes. They spoke of a past that Ben wasn't sure he could fully comprehend. But he knew enough to understand one thing. Nathan had faced demons that most men never would. "I think he was hoping for a different ending tonight," Nathan said, his voice growing quieter. But it wasn't his to control anymore. They both stood there in silence for a long moment, the distant sounds of the town beginning to fill the air again. It wasn't a silence of discomfort. It was the kind of quiet that came with knowing something had shifted, that something had ended. Nathan had faced the ghost of his past, and the past had been laid to rest, once and for all. "Ben," Nathan said finally, his voice steady as always, "the world doesn't change because of people like us. It changes because of people like Elias, the ones who are always pushing, always looking for the next fight. But we're not like that. We don't need to keep proving ourselves." Ben nodded, though there was still a part of him that wanted to ask more, wanted to know the full extent of what had happened between Nathan and Elias. But he could see it in Nathan's eyes. The conversation was over. The sheriff had already closed that chapter. There was no need to revisit it. The wind picked up again, and Nathan turned, walking back toward the office. Ben followed, his footsteps steady behind him. In the distance, the sun was sinking lower in the sky, casting the town in the last rays of orange light. It was the kind of sunset that made you think of the road ahead, of where you had been and where you were going. Deadwood Gulch was the same as it always had been. A town where survival was everything and nothing ever stayed quiet for long. But for Nathan Hale, the legend, the gunslinger, tonight had settled something. And it had settled something deep inside him, too. Tomorrow, he would wake up, put on his hat, and face whatever the world had to offer. Just like he always had. Just like he always would. Because legends weren't made, they were lived. And Nathan Hale had lived enough to know that his time wasn't up yet. But for Elias Drake, his time had come to an end. And Deadwood Gulch, like the rest of the West, would keep turning, silent, steady, and relentless. The night air in Deadwood Gulch was heavy with the scent of dust and would smoke as the final embers of the sunset faded into the horizon. The town, as always, seemed to hold its breath after the storm. Except this time, it wasn't just the usual rumblings of daily life. There was a lingering unease, as if the quiet streets were still unsure whether the past had truly been buried. Sheriff Nathan Hale stood alone outside his office, the weight of the day settling heavily on his shoulders. The saloon had quieted down, and the few remaining patrons had slowly trickled home, casting occasional glances back at the sheriff as if they were still unsure whether they had imagined the whole ordeal. But Nathan knew better. The legend, the man they whispered about behind closed doors, had once again shown itself to be something more than just stories. But it wasn't the legend Nathan was thinking about as he stared out into the dusky horizon. It was the weight of the life he had lived, the choices that had led him to this moment. Behind him, the creak of the door to the sheriff's office broke the silence. It was Ben again, the young deputy, who stepped out into the street, casting a long shadow as he approached Nathan. His face was serious, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, a sense of uncertainty, mixed with something close to admiration. Nathan turned slightly, acknowledging his deputy with a small nod. Ben had been with him long enough to know that silence was often the only answer required. The young man had seen the results of Nathan's quick draw, had heard the rumors that preceded him, but now he was learning the true weight of what it meant to carry such a title. "You sure you're all right?" Ben asked, his voice cautious but genuine. He had spent enough time with Nathan to know when his sheriff was bothered, even if Nathan never showed it. Nathan exhaled, his breath steady despite the weight pressing down on him. "I'm fine," he said simply, but there was something in his eyes. Something that Ben hadn't seen before. Just tired. Been a long road. Ben took a cautious step forward, but his gaze didn't leave Nathan's face. "You don't have to carry it all, Sheriff. Not everything's on your shoulders. You've done more than enough. More than anyone could ask." Nathan's gaze turned toward the horizon again, his eyes scanning the empty street, the empty town that stretched out before him. "Some things can't be helped, Ben. Some things are just part of the life we lead." His voice was soft, almost distant, as though the words came from somewhere deep inside him. The wind stirred the dust in the streets, but Nathan didn't flinch. He had been through more storms than he cared to remember. And though the West was unforgiving, and Deadwood Gulch seemed to be a place where men lived only as long as they could prove they were tougher than the next, Nathan Hale had learned one immutable truth over the years. Survival wasn't just about quick hands or sharp instincts. It was about making the hard choices. And tonight, he had made them. "I've had my fair share of ghosts, Ben," Nathan continued, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "You don't run from them. You don't outrun them. All you can do is face them and make sure they don't catch up." Ben stayed silent, processing Nathan's words. He had seen the sheriff do the impossible time and again, but there was something about this moment, something about the way Nathan was talking, that made Ben realize the true weight of the man he was working with. Nathan wasn't just the sheriff. He wasn't just the fastest shot in the West. He was a man who carried the scars of his past, just like everyone else. "You don't have to fight all the battles alone," Ben finally said, his voice firm now. "There's a reason you've got people around you. People who respect you, who care about you." Nathan's gaze softened just a fraction, his lips twitching as if he were about to say something, but the words never came. Instead, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging the truth in Ben's words without giving too much away. It was enough. More than enough. As the silence stretched between them, Nathan felt the weight of his past pull at him. But in that moment, surrounded by the quiet emptiness of Deadwood Gulch, he realized something he hadn't fully understood until now. There was a kind of peace in knowing that, for the first time in years, he wasn't alone in facing whatever was left of the ghosts that haunted him. "Go on, Ben," Nathan said, breaking the silence with his gravelly voice. "Get some rest. You've earned it." Ben hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, turning back toward the office. As he walked away, Nathan remained where he was, staring into the distance. His heart was heavy, but the pain wasn't as sharp as it had been before. Maybe it was the dust of the day settling, or maybe it was the quiet understanding that no matter how many times the past came knocking, there was always a way to move forward. The street remained empty, save for the occasional gust of wind that blew through the town, carrying with it the whispers of days gone by. But for Nathan Hale, the sheriff who had become both legend and man, there was a certain stillness now, an acceptance of what had come before, and a quiet determination about what was to come. He had survived tonight. He had faced the past, and he had let it go. It was more than just winning a duel or proving his reputation. It was about the life he had carved out in Deadwood Gulch, a life that had seen too much, but still held on. There would be more challenges, more ghosts, more days that tested his resolve. But Nathan Hale had long ago come to terms with one fact. The West didn't care who you were. It only cared about whether you could survive it. As the last of the light faded behind the mountains, Nathan Hale stood alone, his back straight and his mind quiet. The ghosts of his past weren't completely gone, but for now, they were at peace. And that was enough. The moon hung high over Deadwood Gulch, casting a pale light over the quiet town. The stars spread out in the sky like a scattering of old coins. The streets were empty, the sound of crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves the only noises that could be heard in the cool, still air. The night had settled in, and with it, the weight of everything that had happened seemed to fade into the darkness. Sheriff Nathan Hale stood alone outside his office once again. The events of the past few days had taken their toll, and though the town had returned to its normal rhythm, Nathan knew that something had changed. There was a shift in the air, a shift in the way the people of Deadwood Gulch looked at him. The respect, the quiet fear. It was all there, more pronounced now than it had ever been. But for Nathan, none of it mattered. The truth of it all was that the West wasn't a place where men could sit back and enjoy their reputations. The land was too wild, too unforgiving, to let you live on past victories for long. It was the next challenge, the next trial, that would decide who you were. And for Nathan Hale, it had always been that way. He stepped away from the office, his boots moving in the dust of the street. The weight of his gun was familiar at his side, though it no longer felt like an extension of himself. It felt like something heavier, something that served as a reminder of the price he'd paid to be where he was now. He had learned early that there was no peace in the West, not for a man like him. There was only survival, and every day you survived was another day you had to carry the consequences. He made his way to the edge of town, where the tall grass swayed gently in the breeze. The night was cool against his skin, and for the first time in a long while, Nathan felt a sense of calm. The kind of calm that comes not from avoiding the past, but from accepting it. Behind him, a small figure appeared. Ben, his deputy, approached slowly, the younger man's footsteps light on the wooden planks as he caught up to the sheriff. Ben had been quiet all evening, and his presence now felt familiar, comforting even. He was still trying to figure out the man he worked for, but Nathan had always been a mystery, wrapped in layers of silence and unspoken history. "You all right, Sheriff?" Ben asked, his voice gentle. Nathan paused for a moment, letting the question hang in the air. He had lived a life filled with so many dangers, so many threats, that it almost felt like the notion of being all right didn't even make sense anymore. But Ben's words felt different this time, less like a formal question and more like an attempt to understand. "I'm fine, Ben," Nathan answered finally, turning to face his deputy. "Just figuring things out." Ben nodded, but his eyes were still searching Nathan's face, trying to read between the lines. "I don't know if you've noticed, but the town's different now," he said. "People are talking about you more than ever, respecting you more than they ever have." Nathan met Ben's gaze, his expression unreadable. "That's the way it goes," he said quietly. "They'll respect me as long as I can do what needs to be done. But that doesn't last forever." Ben's brow furrowed as he took a step closer. "You don't have to keep proving yourself, Sheriff. Not to anyone. You've done enough. You've earned your place here." Nathan's lips twitched into a faint smile, but it was brief and fleeting. "It's never about earning a place, Ben. Not in this world. You just survive long enough to keep the wolves at bay." The night seemed to stretch on forever, the silence between them both comforting and oppressive. Ben had a lot to learn, but Nathan knew that his deputy was sharp enough to understand the weight of his words, even if he didn't quite grasp them all yet. "You've seen it now, though," Nathan continued. "You've seen the cost of this life. It's not just about pulling the trigger faster than the next man. It's about living with the consequences. And sometimes, it's about letting things go." Ben stood silent, the weight of Nathan's words settling in. He had learned much about the sheriff in the past few years, but tonight, he realized there were depths to Nathan that would never be fully understood by anyone who wasn't right in the thick of it. After a long pause, Ben spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Do you think it's over? The past, do you think you're done with it?" Nathan looked up at the moon, its light casting a pale glow on the grass. For a moment, he was lost in thought, as if the weight of the question had struck him harder than he expected. The past had always been a part of him, something that followed him from town to town, from battle to battle. He had tried to outrun it. He had tried to bury it in the dust of the land. But some things weren't so easily forgotten. "I don't know," Nathan said finally. "Maybe I'll never be done with it. The past has a way of finding you, even when you think you've left it behind." Ben's gaze was steady as he looked at Nathan. "But you'll keep going, won't you?" Nathan met Ben's eyes, his gaze calm, resolute. "I'll keep going," he said quietly, "because that's what we do. We survive, and we keep moving forward, no matter what the past throws at us." The wind stirred the tall grass around them, the sound of it a soft, natural rhythm that almost felt like a reminder. There would be more trials, more ghosts, more days that would test Nathan's resolve. But in the end, that was the only thing he had. His ability to keep going, to keep moving, to keep surviving. The two men stood together, the silence between them comfortable now. The past would always be there, but so would the future. And as long as Nathan Hale had breath in his lungs, he would keep facing whatever came his way. He didn't know what the next day would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of it. And in that moment, as the moon hung high above the land, the sheriff knew that his place in the world wasn't defined by the ghosts he had left behind or the challenges he had faced. It was defined by the strength to keep moving forward, to keep fighting for what mattered. The West had been unforgiving, but for Nathan Hale, it had also been the place where he had found his true self. And that, in the end, was enough. Together, as the night stretched on, Nathan Hale and Ben stood at the edge of Deadwood Gulch, watching the stars above, knowing that whatever came next would be met with the same quiet resolve. The legend of Nathan Hale, the sharpshooter of the West, would live on in the stories whispered in saloons and around campfires. But Nathan? He would keep moving forward, just like he always had. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow for another special story.